Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Tuesday, May 14th, 2024. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. U.S. Army officer resigns over Gaza slaughter. So an Army officer working at the Pentagon's Defense Intelligence Agency, the DIA, has resigned in protest of the U.S.'s unqualified support for the Israeli slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza. Major Harrison Mann posted his resignation letter on LinkedIn and said that it was initially distributed within the DIA on April 16th. In the letter, he said that the DIA does not only inform policy, but facilitates and at times directly executes policy. And he said this in reference to U.S. support for Israel. He said in the letter, quote, "The policy that has never been far from my mind for the past 6 months is the nearly unqualified support for the government of Israel, which has enabled and empowered the killing and starvation of tens of thousands of innocent Palestinians. As we were recently reminded, this unconditional support also encourages reckless escalation that risks wider war," end quote. And he sent this letter right after Iran's response to Israel bombing the Iranian consulate in Damascus. So he said that his work at the DIA had unquestionably contributed to the support for Israel, and that the horrific and heartbreaking images coming from Gaza caused him great shame. So Mann submitted his resignation to the Army on November 1st, but it's not clear exactly when he's actually going to get out of the Army. Mann said in the letter that he tried to continue working his job and hoped that at some point the slaughter would come to an end, or that President Biden would alter his policy of unconditional support. So he said, quote, "However, at some point, whatever the justification, you're either advancing a policy that enables the mass starvation of children, or you're not," end quote. So it's interesting that he pointed to his Jewish heritage as one of his reasons for resigning and speaking out. He said, quote, "And I want to clarify that as a descendant of European Jews, I was raised in a particularly unforgiving moral environment when it came to the topic of bearing responsibility for ethnic cleansing, where the paramount importance of never again and the inadequacy of just following orders were oft repeated," end quote. So I thought that was interesting, the way he said that, referring to, these slogans that we hear, never again, which we've heard Netanyahu and other Israeli officials invoke to justify what they're doing in Gaza. But he also brought up, this idea, of the Nazi, SS guards they were just following orders. It's just an interesting, comparison that he makes there. He continued, quote, "I am haunted by the knowledge that I have failed those principles, but I also have hope that my grandfather would afford me some grace, that he would still be proud of me for stepping away from this war, however belatedly," end quote. So in his post on LinkedIn, and this was written on Monday, so he came out public with this on Monday, Mann said that he received an unexpected outpouring of support after he distributed the letter internally. And that's something I've seen other the officials that resigned from the State Department seem to say that they had a lot of support from within the U.S. government when they publicly resigned. So he said that he was sharing the letter publicly to show his colleagues that they're not alone if they feel opposed to what they're supporting in Gaza. He said, and again, this is his post on Monday, not the letter. He said, quote, "It is clear that this week some of you will still be asked to provide support directly or indirectly to the Israeli military as it conducts operations into Rafah and elsewhere in Gaza. I am sharing it now in the hope that you too will discover you are not alone, you are not voiceless, and you are not powerless, end quote. So it seems like he's hoping some people follow his lead. So this is significant. This is a U.S. Army officer publicly resigning like this. And, you see this picture of him. This isn't some, like hippie guy or something. This is a major in the U.S. Army who's stepping down from a position in the Defense Intelligence Agency. So this is very significant, I think. And hopefully we see more of this. And if I understand things correctly, within the U.S. government, within the State Department, even within the Pentagon, the dissent against this unconditional support for Israel is very real and pretty widespread. And people are getting very frustrated. So we might see more of this. And I just mentioned some of this at the end. So there's been 3 State Department officials who have publicly resigned, 1 Education Department official who has publicly resigned. And I also mentioned the most extreme protests that we've seen from someone within either the U.S. government or the U.S. military. And that was Aaron Bushnell, who was an active duty airman who self-immolated in front of the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C. and died of his wounds. So, I thought it was just really interesting what this letter that he wrote and what he had to say about this resignation. So hopefully this inspires more. All right, so the next one here, Lindsey Graham suggests Israel should nuke Gaza. So on Sunday, Senator Lindsey Graham suggested Israel should drop nuclear weapons on Gaza and compared the Israeli onslaught to World War II. And he said this on NBC's Meet the Press. So Graham said, quote, "When we were faced with destruction as a nation after Pearl Harbor, fighting the Germans and the Japanese, we decided to end the war by bombing Hiroshima, Nagasaki with nuclear weapons," end quote. And he justified the U.S. nuking of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, of course, claiming that it was the right decision, even though it killed hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians. Graham and other Republicans have been fuming at Biden for threatening to withhold heavy bombs for Israel if it launches major attacks on population centers in Rafah. So Graham was asked an interesting question. Why is it okay for Ronald Reagan to leverage military aid to Israel, which he did during the Lebanon War in the 1980s, but it's not okay for Biden to make that threat now? And Graham just immediately pivoted back to World War II. He said, quote, "Why is it okay for America to drop 2 nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to end their existential threat war? Why was it okay to do that? I thought it was okay. To Israel, do whatever you have to do to survive as a Jewish state, whatever you have to do," end quote. And Israel does have nukes. They have a secret nuclear weapons stockpile. It's not really secret, but it's not officially declared. And Israeli officials have repeatedly invoked the U.S. and allied strategic bombing campaigns to justify the destruction in Gaza. And Netanyahu has done this in conversations with President Biden, according to President Biden. And the scale of destruction in Gaza is comparable to the most heavily bombed cities in history, and it's even worse than Dresden in the aftermath of the firebombing of Dresden in 1945. All right, so the next one here, the White House again denies that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. So this was Jake Sullivan, and he was asked about the genocide accusations again, and of course he denied it. Sullivan said, quote, "We believe Israel can and must do more to ensure the protection and well-being of innocent civilians. We do not believe what is happening in Gaza is a genocide. We have been firmly on record rejecting that proposition," end quote. And he is right. The U.S. has firmly rejected the International Court of Justice's ruling that it is plausible that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. If Israel is found guilty of genocide, it would implicate Sullivan and other U.S. officials, as they have provided military and political support to enable the slaughter. Sullivan said the U.S. was, quote, "using the internationally accepted term for genocide, which includes a focus on intent, to reach its assessment," end quote. So I thought it was interesting that he meant that that he mentioned that the definition of genocide includes a focus on intent. And we have seen, and I would think, if anything, intent, I think it's pretty clear what the Israelis intend to do. What they really want to do is, cleanse Gaza of its Palestinian population. And if that doesn't happen, they're going to make life as miserable as possible for them and kill as many as they can. That seems to be the goal, based on leaked Israeli intelligence reports that say that is the best case scenario for Israel, and comments from Israeli government officials, ministers, about how they want to kick the Palestinians out and reestablish Jewish settlements. And in the genocide case against Israel, South Africa cited comments from Israeli officials as evidence of Israel's intent to commit genocide against the Palestinians living in Gaza. And some notable quotes include, Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant saying that Israel was fighting human animals. And he said that in October when announcing a complete siege on the Gaza Strip. All right, so the next one here, American doctors trapped in Gaza are facing dehydration. So this is a story from The Intercept, and it says upward of 20 American doctors are trapped in Gaza as a result of Israel's post-invasion closure of the Rafah border crossing into Egypt, according to two sources with knowledge of the plight of two ill-fated medical missions. Israel has blocked fuel, food, and water from entering Rafah for over a week, leading to severe dehydration among the general population, as well as among the doctors on the mission. Relatives of the doctors were told by the State Department that rescue efforts were underway, including through coordination with the United Nations and the Israeli Defense Forces. Yet on Monday, the Israeli military fired on a UN vehicle that was traveling to the European hospital in Khan Yunis near Rafah, killing a UN employee and injuring another. A family member of one of the doctors stranded at the European hospital said that he suspected the vehicle was part of the rescue mission, but was uncertain. So they fired on a clearly marked UN vehicle and killed, I believe it was a foreign aid worker, a foreign UN employee that they killed. So among the stranded doctors is Adam Hamaway, a plastic surgeon and Army veteran from New Jersey. While serving in Iraq, he was on duty when now Senator Tammy Duckworth's mangled body was brought to the hospital after her helicopter was shot down. She credits him with saving her life. Now he's stuck in Gaza. And he did an interview basically saying he's never performed so many amputations and things in his life. I mean, it's really horrific. So the doctors are rationing water, and at least one physician is in poor health and is on an IV drip to combat dehydration. So this is an American physician who has not been in Gaza very long, who is on an IV drip because dehydration is that bad. So imagine how bad it is for the Palestinians that have been stuck there this whole time, that are displaced. And again, so we've seen there's some aid coming into Gaza through the northern border crossings, but none of it has gotten to Rafah. In a week. It's been a week now, so it's just a very bad situation. Israel ordered more evacuations on Monday. They continue to escalate in Rafah. The U.S. hasn't taken any of the action that Biden has threatened so far. All right, so the next one here, the UN clarifies that the Gaza death toll has not changed. So on Monday, the UN said that the number of Palestinians killed by Israel in Gaza since October 7th has not changed, and that figure has surpassed 35,000. UN spokesman Farhan Haq made the clarification after the UN's Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs published figures from Gaza's health ministry that showed the number of Palestinians killed who have been fully identified. And this was as of April 30th. 24,686 Palestinians had been fully identified, meaning they weren't missing any information about them, out of the 34,622 total fatalities. So this, I hope that you don't get lost in the numbers here, but there's a lot of these stories saying that the UN halved the number of women and children killed in Gaza. because out of the 24,686 Palestinians that they said were fully identified, there were 7,797 children and 4,955 women, about 2,000 elderly and 10,000 men. So the figures were published by the UN on May 8th. And 2 days before that, they published figures using the estimates from Gaza's media office that said 34,735 Palestinians had been killed, including over 14,500 children and 9,500 women. So then, the number of verified, the people who have been fully identified, it's different numbers that they were using here, and those come from Gaza's health ministry. These are people that they have the names for, they have their ID numbers, and all that. And then there's about 10,000 bodies that haven't been fully identified, they say. So this discrepancy led to these claims that the UN had halved the number of women and children killed in Gaza. But Hawk clarified that the overall death toll hasn't changed and that the latest numbers did not take into account the roughly 10,000 dead Palestinians who haven't been fully identified. And according to CNN, Gaza's health ministry said in its latest report that a total of 15,103 children and 9,961 women have been killed in Gaza since October 7th. So they're still standing by. They're still standing by the estimates of. They're saying over 15,000 children have been killed. So Hawk added that the UN has not been able to verify the figures from Gaza's health ministry, but noted that their numbers have been historically accurate, and that's something that's been acknowledged by U.S. and Israeli officials. Back in January, the Hebrew language news site Local Call reported that the Israeli military determined the figures from Gaza's health ministry were reliable and used them to estimate how many civilians they've killed. And two Palestinian health ministry officials told CNN that the total number of deaths, that 35,000 number, also does not include about 10,000 people who are missing and presumed dead under the rubble. So that would put the death toll, around 45,000 if all of those people were dead. So again, I hope I didn't get you lost in the numbers there, but there's still, I think this is kind of an important story because there was a lot of coverage of that claim that they have the number of women and children who were killed. All right, so the next one here, Israel unleashes heaviest bombing in months. So this article is from Middle East Eye, and it says the Israeli military has launched a new wave of attacks across the Gaza Strip, similar in intensity to the peak of its 7th-month war on the besieged Palestinian enclave. So heavy airstrikes were reported across the Strip over the weekend and on Monday, with attacks since Friday killing at least 180 Palestinians and wounding dozens more, according to the Palestinian Health Ministry. The raids coincided with incursions into Jabalia in northern Gaza, the Zaytun neighborhood in Gaza City, and eastern Rafah. The ground advances have been met with fierce resistance by Hamas and other Palestinian groups, with at least 5 Israeli soldiers killed over the weekend, the Israeli military said. Another 68 had been wounded over the past 48 hours, including a brigadier general and deputy defense establishment comptroller, the most senior Israeli official wounded in the war so far. So now the number of Palestinians who have evacuated Rafah, the estimate is up to 360,000. So it just goes to show kind of the scale of how things have been, basically since Biden said, I might, not arm them with these heavy bombs if they go too far, but here they are escalating and escalating. All right, so the next one here, Israeli protesters block aid convoy headed to Gaza. This article is from Reuters. It says Israeli protesters blocked aid trucks headed for Gaza on Monday, strewing food packages on the road in the latest in a series of incidents that have come as Israel has pledged to allow uninterrupted humanitarian supplies into Gaza, but that has not happened clearly. And there was videos on social media showing protesters throwing supplies from the trucks onto the ground with the contents of open cartons lying spilled across the road. And this is something that's been happening. And I believe these are settlers in the occupied West Bank. And there's videos of them, and this happened a few days ago as well, dumping flour on the road and dumping food that's going to starving Palestinians just out on the ground. And it's just, the optics of that alone is just not helping Israel when it comes to the public relations battle. And, all the outrage and kind of hysteria we've seen about the protests in the United States against the Israeli slaughter in Gaza. You don't see so much about the Israelis blocking aid like this. All right, so the next one here, Ukraine's Kharkiv commander replaced as Russia advances. So Ukrainian media reported on Monday that the Ukrainian general responsible for the northeastern Kharkiv Oblast was fired on May 11th, one day after Russian forces launched a new offensive in the region that has had significant success. So this news came as Ukrainian troops were speaking out about the lack of defenses in Kharkiv. So Denis Yaroslavsky, a commander of a Ukrainian special reconnaissance unit, he said, he wrote this on Facebook and he made comments to several media outlets. He said, quote, "There was no first line of defense. We saw it. The Russians just walked in. They just walked in without any mined field. Either it was an act of negligence or corruption. It wasn't a failure. It was a betrayal," end quote. And he's saying it was a failure, an act of negligence on Ukraine's part. He's a Ukrainian soldier fighting on the front lines who was furious about the fact that they were not ready for this Russian incursion. And according to BBC, everybody knew that Russia was likely planning an incursion in the region, as Ukrainian and Western intelligence showed that Russia was building a force on the other side of the border, with estimates that 30,000 troops had been amassed. So, and if you see this map from South Front, this is the areas where Russia is making gains here. So Ukrainian officials say that they believe Russia is trying to stretch their defenses, and their lines were already at risk of collapse. Kirilo Budanov, the head of Ukraine's military intelligence, he spoke with the New York Times on Monday and basically said that the situation was critical, that they don't have any more forces to spare. They've used all the reserves that they have. They don't have anybody else. So if the defense fails, could be really bad news for Ukraine when it comes to losing territory to the Russians. And there's been heavy Russian bombings in the areas as well, and thousands of civilians have fled. According to the governor of Kharkiv, Russian strikes had hit more than 30 towns and villages on Monday in the past 24 hours. Wounding 9 people, and Ukraine has kept up its strikes on Belgorod, which is the Russian oblast that borders the region. And those strikes killed 11 civilians on Sunday. All right, so the next one here, Ukraine says that EU plan for $3 billion per year is almost nothing. So a Ukrainian official has said that an EU plan to provide Kiev with up to 3 billion euros or $3.2 billion per year for military aid amounts to almost nothing in the context of the war. So EU ambassadors agreed to use profits generated by frozen Russian central bank assets to purchase up to $3.2 billion worth of weapons for Ukraine annually. But Ukraine's Justice Minister Denis Maluska told Politico last Thursday that Ukraine needs hundreds of billions of dollars. He said, quote, "If we are talking about the needs of Ukraine and the needs of the war, military and non-military, 3 billion euros is actually almost nothing. We need hundreds of billions in order to win the war. It's a good first step," end quote. So we've seen this pattern of Zelensky, they're just continue to demand more and more, the Ukrainian officials, even though the West has been shelling over quite a bit of cash and weapons lately, especially since the U.S. approved that $61 billion. And so this is the EU's plan to use the profits from Russian assets, frozen Russian assets. So it's a very controversial plan, a significant escalation of the economic campaign against Moscow. It could set a very bad precedent. And I think, Western banks are against this idea. They don't want to face legal action from Russia, and they're worried that other countries are going to see this and start pulling their assets from Western banks. And the U.S. wants to use, there's about $300 billion in frozen Russian central bank funds held by the U.S., Europe, and other allies. And the U.S. wants to give all that to Ukraine. But there's a lot of hesitation from other European countries when it comes to that plan. But Ukraine is demanding it, saying, fork it all over. We need the hundreds of billions of dollars. All right, so the next one here, Sweden is open to hosting NATO nuclear weapons. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. The Swedish prime minister said that his country would be willing to host nuclear weapons during a war. And NATO has a nuclear sharing program. Under that, the U.S. has nukes deployed in 5 countries. So I haven't seen, maybe I missed it, maybe I don't remember. I know Finland, since they joined NATO or while they're in the process of joining NATO, they said that they were open to hosting nukes, and they're right on the Russian border. And now Swedish Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson is saying that in a war situation, Sweden would be willing to host nuclear weapons. And Poland has been saying that they want nuclear weapons. They want to expand the NATO nuclear sharing program. And Russia just deployed nukes to Belarus that started last year, and they're doing these nuclear exercises now. So just goes to show, how high tensions are in Europe with Russia. You have these NATO countries just saying things like this, just things that would have been unthinkable a few years ago, I think. All right. So the last story here, China denies Philippine claim about artificial island. So this article is from the South China Morning Post, and it's just more tensions between China and the Philippines in the South China Sea. I kind of want to just keep people aware of this stuff because I feel like it doesn't get much attention. China has denied claims by the Philippine Coast Guard that it's trying to build an artificial island at the disputed Sabina Shoal in the South China Sea. On Monday, Wang Wenbin, a spokesman for the Chinese Foreign Ministry, dismissed claims as groundless and pure fabrication. So this is another disputed atoll or reef, whatever you want to call it, in the South China Sea, and there's been some tensions over this one as well. And the reason why we try to focus on this is because the U.S. has told the Philippines, has told China, that if Philippine vessels come under attack in the South China Sea, that would trigger the U.S.'s mutual defense commitments to the Philippines under the Mutual Defense Treaty. So basically, they're threatening to intervene. So please, that is it for the news for today. Go check out our Viewpoints. Help us with our fundraiser. It's going very well. We're getting close to the end. So please help us with that. And we had a letter sent out on Monday from Daniel McAdams, Ron Paul's co-host over at the Liberty Report. And they use our stuff all the time. It's really cool to always hear that, Ron Paul and Dan reading from my articles and everything. So it goes to show antiwar.com is a resource for a lot of people, a lot of people like them who have big platforms and other journalists and researchers and writers. A lot of people, we had John Mearsheimer say he visits antiwar.com every day. So go to antiwar.com/donate if you want to help us out with that. Go check out our Viewpoints. We have one from Connor Freeman. Goodbye to Pete McCloskey, an anti-war hero. So this was a really good write-up that Connor did about Pete McCloskey, the late Republican congressman who just passed away recently. And he really challenged, the war party. He challenged Nixon. And there's some really interesting things about him in this. So please go check that out. One from Ted Galen Carpenter, NATO's new burden sharing objectives. One from Aaron Sobczak, the Abraham Accords further complicated America's place in the Middle East. One from Dave Zurin, Macklemore dares others to stand up for Palestine. One from Sarah Strider, Dear Joe Biden, a message on Rafah from U.S. military families. So please go check all of that out. You could also support us by sharing the show. Tell your friends about antiwar.com. Like and subscribe wherever you watch. And if you listen to the show, you could leave reviews and ratings depending on where you listen to the podcast version. But that is it for me for today. I will be back tomorrow. Thanks for listening.